The river roared with spring meltwater the day Tessa Deveraux decided her life wasn't worth living anymore. Knee-deep in the frigid current, her sodden skirts heavy as lead weights, she took another step forward, welcoming the numbing cold that crawled up her legs and promised to wash away the pain that had consumed her since that terrible night 3 months ago, Colorado territory, 1875. Spring had come early to the valley, transforming the landscape with wildflowers and greening aspens, but Tessa remained trapped in the darkest winter of her soul. The rushing waters of the Clearwater River beckoned, promising peace, promising forgetfulness. She had walked for miles from the small town of Silver Creek, her boots now abandoned on the riverbank beside the letter she'd left, just a few lines explaining that she couldn't bear to remember anymore. The memories were too painful, too raw. Her father's gambling debts. The fire that had claimed their ranch house and her parents within it. The vicious rumors that followed, whispers that she had somehow been responsible. Just let go, she whispered to herself, taking another unsteady step deeper into the current. The water now reached her waist, the powerful flow threatening to sweep her feet from beneath her. Just one more step, maybe two, and the river would claim her. From the riverbank, Thomas Norwood watched in alarm. He had been tracking a wounded deer when he spotted the woman wading into the dangerous spring currents. At first, he thought she might be crossing, but her deliberate, slow movements told a different story. "Hey," he called out, his voice nearly lost in the rush of water. "Stop." The river's too high. Tessa didn't turn. Either she hadn't heard him or she was choosing to ignore his warning. Thomas dropped his rifle on the bank and sprinted downstream, calculating where the current might carry her. The Clearwater was notorious for its hidden rocks and sudden drops. He'd seen men twice his size drowned in its depths. Tessa closed her eyes as the water reached her chest, the numbing cold seeping into her bones. This was better, she thought, better than remembering. Better than seeing the flames every time she closed her eyes. Better than hearing her mother's final screams. She barely registered the splash behind her or the strong arms that suddenly encircled her waist. Her body was too cold to fight as she was dragged backward through the current, away from the oblivion she sought. "Let me go," she finally managed to gasp as her head cleared, the rush of adrenaline cutting through her despair. "Not a chance, miss," came the firm reply, the man's breath warm against her ear as he struggled against the current. With powerful strokes, Thomas pulled them both toward the bank, fighting the river's attempts to drag them downstream. When his boots finally found purchase on the rocky riverbed, he lifted the woman partly out of the water, half carrying, half dragging her to shore. Tessa collapsed on the grassy bank, coughing and sputtering, her dark hair plastered to her face, her blue calico dress clinging to her slender frame. Thomas knelt beside her, his own clothes soaked through. "Are you trying to get yourself killed?" he demanded, his voice rough with exertion and concern. "That was the general idea," Tessa replied bitterly, not meeting his eyes. Thomas fell silent, studying her pale face. She was young, perhaps 22 or 23, with delicate features and eyes the color of storm clouds. Beautiful despite her current bedraggled state. "Whatever you're trying to forget," he said finally, his voice softer now, "drowning yourself won't help." Tessa's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with anger. "What do you know about it?" "I know that remembering is hard," he said, reaching out to brush a strand of wet hair from her face. His touch was surprisingly gentle for a man with such rough, calloused hands. "But it's necessary." "Remember," he said softly. "Remember who you are." Tessa stared at him, really seeing him for the first time. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-browned skin and eyes the color of aged whiskey. A cowboy, judging by his attire, worn denim pants, a faded blue shirt, and scuffed leather boots. A day's worth of stubble darkened his jaw, and a small scar bisected his right eyebrow. "You don't know me," she whispered. "No," he agreed, standing and offering his hand. "But I'd like to. I'm Thomas Norwood." After a moment's hesitation, she placed her trembling hand in his. "Tessa Deveraux." "Well, Miss Deveraux," he said, pulling her to her feet, "you're shivering something fierce. My cabin's not far from here. I can offer you dry clothes and a fire to warm yourself by." Tessa hesitated. She had come to the river to die, not to follow a stranger to his cabin. But the cold was seeping into her bones, and now that the moment had passed, a flicker of shame burned in her chest. "I should get back to town," she said weakly. Thomas shook his head. "Town's 5 miles from here and you're half frozen. You'll catch your death before you make it halfway." He paused, then added with a hint of a smile, "And it seems a shame to rescue you from drowning only to let you die of pneumonia." Despite herself, Tessa felt the corner of her mouth twitch in response. "I suppose that would be rather ungrateful of me." Thomas retrieved his rifle from where he'd left it upstream, then led Tessa along a narrow trail through a stand of pines. They walked in silence, Tessa hugging herself against the chill, Thomas occasionally glancing back to make sure she was following. His cabin appeared through the trees, a sturdy, well-built structure of logs and stone with a small corral attached to one side. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and Tessa could see a chestnut horse watching their approach with mild interest. "You left your fire burning?" she asked, the first words either had spoken since leaving the riverbank. Thomas nodded. "I wasn't planning to be gone long, was just tracking a wounded buck when I spotted you." Inside, the cabin was neat and sparsely furnished: a table and 2 chairs, a small cook stove, a bed in one corner and a trunk at its foot. Thomas stoked the fire in the stone hearth, then rummaged through the trunk. "These will be too big," he said, handing her a flannel shirt and a pair of trousers, "but they're dry. There's a blanket there too, you can change behind that screen." He nodded toward a wooden folding screen in the corner. "I'll make some coffee." Tessa accepted the clothes without argument, too cold and exhausted to protest. Behind the screen, she peeled off her sodden dress and petticoats with difficulty, her fingers stiff and clumsy. Thomas's shirt hung almost to her knees, the sleeves extending well past her fingertips. She rolled them up as best she could and cinched the trousers with a piece of rope she found draped over the screen. When she emerged, Thomas had his back to her, busy at the stove. He'd changed as well, into dry clothes similar to what he'd been wearing before. His wet garments hung on pegs near the fire. "Sit by the fire," he said without turning. "Coffee's almost ready." Tessa wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and sank onto a stool near the hearth, holding her hands out to the flames. The warmth was heavenly after the river's icy grip. Outside, the sky had begun to darken, the afternoon giving way to evening. Thomas handed her a steaming mug. "It's strong," he warned. She took a cautious sip. The coffee was indeed strong, but the heat of it spreading through her chest was worth the bitter taste. "Thank you," she said quietly, both for the coffee and for the rescue she hadn't wanted. Thomas nodded, taking a seat across from her. "Want to talk about why you were trying to drown yourself in the Clearwater?" Tessa stared into her mug. "Not particularly." "Fair enough." He sipped his own coffee. "Where are you staying in Silver Creek, the boarding house, Mrs. Wilson's place?" She glanced up. "I've only been there a few months." Thomas nodded. "I know it, decent place. The widow Wilson makes a fine apple pie." A silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional whinny from the horse outside. "I lost my parents," Tessa said suddenly, the words spilling out before she could stop them. 3 months ago, there was a fire." Thomas's expression softened. "I'm sorry to hear that. People in town say. They say my father set it himself after losing everything at the gambling tables." Her voice caught. "They say he killed my mother and himself rather than face his debts." "And what do you say?" Tessa's hands tightened around the mug. "I say he would never. He loved her. He loved me." She swallowed hard. "But I wasn't there. I was in town at a dance, and when I came home—" "The house was gone," Thomas finished gently. She nodded, tears filling her eyes. "Everything was gone. And the things people whisper when they think I can't hear. It's unbearable." Thomas set his mug down and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. People talk, it's what they do, especially in small towns where there's little else for entertainment. His eyes met hers. But their talk doesn't make it true. I know that, Tessa whispered, but I keep thinking, if I had been there, maybe I could have. Or maybe you'd be dead too, Thomas said bluntly, and that wouldn't help anyone, least of all your parents. Tessa looked away, blinking back tears. I just want to forget, I want the pain to stop. It won't, Thomas said simply, not completely, but it gets more bearable with time. I know something about loss, Miss Deveraux. She looked up at him questioningly. Lost my wife and daughter to scarlet fever 5 years ago, he said, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of old pain. Thought about walking into a river myself once or twice. What stopped you? Tessa asked softly. Thomas gave a small, sad smile. Responsibility at first. Had livestock to tend, a ranch to run. Then, after a while, I realized that living was a way to honor them, remembering them, keeping their memory alive. It hurt, but it was also a gift. He reached across and took her hand. The past shapes us, Miss Deveraux. Forgetting isn't the answer. Remembering and learning to live with those memories, that's the hard part, the necessary part. Tessa felt a tear slide down her cheek. I don't know if I can. You can, Thomas said firmly, and you will. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's single window. Thomas glanced toward it. Storm's coming. You'll have to stay the night. I'll sleep by the fire. You can take the bed. Tessa began to protest, but Thomas held up a hand. I won't hear arguments on this. It's no trouble. As if to emphasize his point, rain began to patter against the roof, quickly intensifying to a downpour. Tessa relented with a nod. They ate a simple supper of beans, bacon, and biscuits, sharing stories as the storm raged outside. Thomas told her about his cattle ranch a few miles away, where a foreman and several hands were looking after things while he spent a few days at the hunting cabin. Tessa spoke of her life before Silver Creek, of growing up on a small ranch in Kansas, of her father teaching her to ride and her mother's talent for coaxing flowers to grow in the harsh prairie soil. It was strange, she thought, how easy it was to talk to this man she'd just met. Perhaps it was because he'd already seen her at her lowest, most desperate moment. Or perhaps it was because he listened without judgment, his eyes warm with understanding. The hour grew late, and Tessa found herself fighting to keep her eyes open. The emotional and physical exhaustion of the day was catching up with her. You should get some rest, Thomas said, noticing her stifled yawn. We'll head back to town in the morning once the storm passes. Tessa nodded and moved to the bed, still wrapped in the blanket he'd given her. Thank you, Mr. Norwood, for everything. Thomas, he corrected with a small smile, and you're welcome, Tessa. She lay awake for a time, listening to the rain on the roof and Thomas's quiet movements as he settled by the fire. Despite everything, despite the grief that still weighted her heart, she felt a curious sense of peace in this small cabin with this quiet, thoughtful man. Eventually, the rhythm of the rain lulled her into a deep, dreamless sleep. Morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed the world clean. Tessa woke to the smell of coffee and bacon and the sound of Thomas moving about the cabin. Good morning, he greeted her with a smile that transformed his normally serious face. Hope you slept well. Better than I have in months, she admitted, surprised to find it was true. After breakfast, Thomas saddled his horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding named Rusty. We'll both ride, he explained. It'll be faster than walking. He helped her mount, then swung up behind her, his arms reaching around her to take the reins. Tessa was acutely aware of his closeness, of the solid warmth of his chest against her back. The ride to Silver Creek was peaceful, the morning air fresh and cool after the storm. Thomas pointed out various landmarks along the way: an eagle's nest in a tall pine, the remains of an old prospector's cabin, a meadow where wild strawberries would soon ripen. You know the land well, Tessa observed. Been here 15 years, Thomas replied. Came west after the war looking for a fresh start, found this valley and never left. As they approached the outskirts of Silver Creek, Tessa felt anxiety building in her chest. The town suddenly seemed like a hostile place, full of judgmental stares and whispered accusations. Thomas, sensing her tension, said quietly, "You don't have to stay here, if the memories are too painful." "Where would I go?" Tessa asked, her voice small. Thomas was silent for a moment. "My ranch could use a housekeeper," he said finally. "The place has been neglected since." "Well, since my wife passed, and I've got a small cabin on the property where you could stay, if you wanted." Tessa turned her head slightly to look at him. "You barely know me." "I know enough," he said simply. "I know you're hurting, I know what that's like. And I know that sometimes a change of scenery can help." She considered his offer. The idea of leaving Silver Creek, of escaping the whispers and stares, was tempting. But she hardly knew this man, this quiet cowboy who had pulled her from the river. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Thomas nodded, seemingly satisfied with her response. Fair enough. They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence. When they reached Mrs. Wilson's boarding house, Thomas dismounted first, then helped Tessa down. Her borrowed clothes had earned them curious glances from passers-by, but Tessa found she didn't care as much as she might have expected. "Thank you again," she said, looking up at him. "For everything." Thomas touched the brim of his hat. "Remember what I said, Tessa. Living is the hard part. But it's worth it." With that, he mounted Rusty and rode away, leaving Tessa to face Mrs. Wilson's questions about her absence and her unusual attire. The next few days passed slowly. Tessa went through the motions of her daily routine, helping in the boarding house kitchen, walking to the general store for supplies, attending Sunday services at the small church. But Thomas's words stayed with her, as did his offer. A week after the incident at the river, Tessa was sweeping the boarding house porch when she spotted a familiar figure riding down the street. Thomas Norwood sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the afternoon sun. He pulled Rusty to a stop in front of the boarding house and dismounted in one fluid motion. "Miss Deveraux," he greeted her, touching his hat brim. "I was hoping I might find you here." Tessa leaned the broom against the wall. "Mr. Norwood, what brings you to town?" "Supplies," he said, gesturing to the saddlebags, "and I wanted to see how you were faring." "Better," she said, and was surprised to find it was true. The grief was still there, a constant ache, but it no longer threatened to drown her. "Thank you for asking." Thomas nodded. "I'm glad to hear it." He hesitated, then added, "That offer still stands if you're interested. No pressure, of course." Tessa studied him, taking in his earnest expression, the kindness in his eyes. In the week since their encounter, she'd thought often of his offer, weighing it against her options in Silver Creek. "I've been considering it," she admitted. "But I barely know you, Mr. Norwood." "That's fair," he acknowledged. "Perhaps we could remedy that. Would you do me the honor of having dinner with me this evening, at the hotel restaurant, perhaps?" Tessa hesitated only briefly. "I would like that." That evening, dressed in her best and only good dress, a modest navy blue with white lace at the collar, Tessa met Thomas at the Silver Creek Hotel. He'd cleaned up for the occasion, his usually rumpled clothes replaced by a well-fitting suit, his hair neatly combed, his jaw freshly shaven. They were seated at a corner table, somewhat removed from the other diners. Tessa was painfully aware of the curious glances directed their way. Thomas Norwood was well known in the area, a successful rancher who rarely socialized, and her own notoriety as the daughter of the Deveraux tragedy made them a subject of interest. "People are staring," she murmured, arranging her napkin in her lap. Thomas glanced around, his expression unconcerned. "Let them. They'll find something new to gossip about soon enough." The dinner was pleasant, the food better than Tessa had expected from the small hotel. Thomas proved to be an attentive companion, asking thoughtful questions about her interests and sharing stories of his own life before and after coming to Colorado. "My father was a blacksmith in Virginia," he told her as they lingered over dessert. "Wanted me to follow in his footsteps, but I always dreamed of open spaces. The war gave me a taste for wandering. Afterward, I couldn't settle back into that small town life." "So you came west?" Tessa said. Thomas nodded. Worked as a ranch hand for a few years, saved every penny. When old man Jensen decided to sell his place, I scraped together enough for a down payment. He smiled at the memory. It was just a run-down cabin in 100 acres back then, barely enough grass to feed 20 head of cattle. And now it's the Double N Ranch. 1,500 acres, 400 head of cattle, some of the best grazing land in the territory. There was quiet pride in his voice, not boastful but satisfied. "You built all that yourself?" Tessa asked, impressed. Thomas's expression grew more serious. "Not by myself. My wife, Eleanor, she was there for the hardest years. We built it together." He paused. "After she and our daughter died, I nearly lost it all. Couldn't seem to care enough to keep going. But eventually I realized that letting everything we'd built crumble away would be another kind of death. So I pulled myself together and kept building." Tessa reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "I'm sorry for your loss, Thomas, truly." He turned his hand to grasp hers gently. "As I am for yours. Grief is a hard road, Tessa, but it gets more navigable with time. And it helps not to walk it alone." The look in his eyes made her heart beat faster. There was understanding there, and something more, a warmth, an interest that went beyond mere kindness to a stranger. As they walked back to the boarding house after dinner, Thomas offered his arm and Tessa took it, feeling the solid strength of him beside her. The evening air was cool and sweet with the scent of spring flowers. "I've enjoyed this evening," Thomas said as they reached Mrs. Wilson's front gate. "So have I," Tessa replied honestly. Thomas hesitated, then said, "I'll be in town for another day handling some business at the bank. Perhaps you join me for lunch tomorrow. We could discuss that job offer further." Tessa smiled. "I'd like that very much." The next day, over lunch at the small cafe near the general store, Thomas outlined his proposal in more detail. "The main house needs attention," he explained. "It's clean enough, but it lacks a woman's touch, I suppose. The cooking is adequate. My foreman's wife handles that part-time, but the place could use someone to manage it properly. There's a small cabin about a quarter-mile from the main house. It was built for the previous owner's mother, but it stood empty for years. You'd have your privacy there." "And my duties would include?" Tessa asked. "Keeping the house in order, managing the household accounts, perhaps overseeing the kitchen garden. Nothing beyond your capabilities, I'm sure." Tessa considered the offer. It was generous, and it would give her a fresh start away from the painful memories and whispers of Silver Creek. "May I see the ranch before I decide?" she asked. Thomas smiled. "I was hoping you'd ask. How about Saturday? I can send a wagon for you." They agreed on the details, and when they parted that afternoon, Tessa felt a lightness in her step that had been absent for months. The prospect of a new beginning, of purpose, was invigorating. Saturday dawned clear and mild. Tessa had packed a small bag with essentials for the day trip and was waiting on the boarding house porch when a wagon pulled up, driven by a weathered older man with a friendly smile. "Miss Deveraux," he called. "I'm Hank Cooper, foreman at the Double N. Boss sent me to fetch you." The drive to the ranch took nearly 2 hours, giving Tessa ample time to admire the beautiful countryside and chat with Hank, who proved to be a wealth of information about the ranch and its owner. "Mr. Norwood's a fair boss," Hank told her. "Expects hard work but pays well for it. And he's generous in hard times. During that drought 3 years back, he kept on men he didn't strictly need, knowing they had families to feed." Tessa found herself increasingly curious about the man who had pulled her from the river. The more she learned, the more she wanted to know. The Double N Ranch came into view as they crested a hill, a sprawling property nestled in a verdant valley, with mountains rising majestically in the distance. The main house was larger than Tessa had expected, a 2-story structure of logs and stone with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Several outbuildings clustered nearby, and in the distance, she could see cattle grazing on rolling grasslands. Thomas was waiting on the porch as the wagon pulled up, and he came down the steps to help Tessa down. "Welcome to the Double N," he said, his smile warm and genuine. The tour of the property was comprehensive. Thomas showed her the main house first, a spacious, well-built home that was indeed clean but lacking the touches that made a house truly comfortable. The furniture was good quality but arranged with a man's practicality rather than an eye for comfort or beauty. Eleanor had a knack for making a place feel like home, Thomas explained as they moved through the rooms. I've never quite figured out her secret. After the main house, they visited the bunkhouse where the ranch hands lived, the barn with its impressive collection of horses, the smithy where a burly man was shoeing a gray mare, and finally, the small cabin that would be Tessa's if she accepted the position. The cabin was charming, a single room with a small attached kitchen, simply furnished but cozy. A stone fireplace dominated one wall and windows let in plenty of light. It had stood empty for some time, but Thomas had clearly had it cleaned recently. "It's lovely," Tessa said, running her hand along the smooth wooden mantelpiece. "It needs some attention," Thomas admitted, "but it's solid. No leaks in the roof and the chimney draws well." After the tour, they had dinner with Hank and his wife, Martha, a cheerful woman who had clearly gone to extra effort for the meal. The conversation was easy, with much laughter and storytelling. As twilight approached, Thomas suggested a short ride to show Tessa one last feature of the property. They mounted a pair of gentle horses and rode along a well-worn trail that led up a small hill. At the summit, Thomas reined in his horse and dismounted, helping Tessa down as well. The view was breathtaking, the entire ranch spread out below them, bathed in the golden light of sunset. "This is my favorite spot on the whole property," Thomas said quietly. "When things get overwhelming, I come here to think." Tessa moved to stand beside him, their shoulders nearly touching as they gazed out over the valley. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. "It is," Thomas agreed. After a moment, he turned to face her. "Tessa, I want to be honest with you. When I offered you this job, it wasn't just because the house needs attention. It was because I've enjoyed your company more than I expected to." Tessa's heart quickened at his words. "I've enjoyed yours as well, Thomas." "I know it's only been a short time," he continued, "and I understand if you're not ready, but I'd like the chance to know you better. Not just as my housekeeper, but as—" He trailed off, seemingly uncertain how to express what he was feeling. "As a friend," Tessa suggested gently. Thomas met her eyes. "Yes, and perhaps in time as something more." Tessa was silent for a moment, considering his words. 2 weeks ago, she had been ready to end her life, convinced that the pain of loss was too great to bear. Now, standing on this hilltop with this kind, thoughtful man, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel again: hope. "I'd like that," she said softly. The smile that spread across Thomas's face was like the sun breaking through clouds. Hesitantly, he reached out to take her hand, his touch gentle but firm. As they stood there, hands clasped, watching the sun set over the Double N Ranch, Tessa thought about the twists of fate that had brought her to this moment. If Thomas hadn't been tracking that deer, if he hadn't spotted her in the river, if he hadn't pulled her back and told her to remember. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked. Noticing her introspection, Tessa smiled. "I was thinking about remembering. About how sometimes the hardest thing to do is also the most necessary." Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The memories don't go away," he said softly, "but they change. The sharp edges get smoother. And new memories join them until the pain isn't the only thing you feel when you look back." Tessa squeezed his hand. "I think I'd like to make some new memories here, Thomas, if your offer still stands." "It does," he assured her. 2 days later, Tessa moved into the small cabin on the Double N Ranch. The work was satisfying, bringing order and warmth back to a house that had been merely functional for too long. And true to his word, Thomas gave her time and space, their relationship developing slowly from employer and employee to friends who shared meals and conversations. Summer came to the valley, bringing long, golden days and short, star-filled nights. Tessa planted a garden beside her cabin, coaxing vegetables and flowers from the rich soil. She learned the rhythms of ranch life, the seasonal cycles of calving and branding, haying and shipping cattle to market, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, her heart began to heal. The memories of her parents were still there, but as Thomas had promised, they changed. She could remember her mother's laugh without feeling the stabbing pain of loss. She could think of her father's strong hands guiding hers as she learned to ride without drowning in guilt that she hadn't been there to save him. One evening in late August, Thomas invited Tessa to dinner at the main house, not unusual in itself, as they often shared meals. But when she arrived, she found the dining room transformed. The table was set with fine china and silver that must have been Aline's. Candles glowed softly in silver holders, and the scent of roasting beef filled the air. Thomas greeted her at the door, dressed in his best suit, a nervous smile playing around his lips. "What's the occasion?" Tessa asked, smoothing the skirt of the new dress she'd made from fabric ordered from Denver. 4 months, Thomas said simply. 4 months since I pulled a stubborn, beautiful woman from the Clearwater River. Tessa's eyes widened. "You've been counting." "Every day," he admitted. "Every day that I've been grateful you're still here." The dinner was delicious. Martha had outdone herself, but Tessa hardly tasted it, too aware of Thomas watching her across the table, too conscious of the current of anticipation running between them. After dessert, Thomas suggested a walk in the garden Tessa had planted behind the house. The evening air was warm, heavy with the scent of late summer roses. "Tessa," Thomas said, stopping beside a rose bush heavy with blooms, "these past months have been. They've brought me back to life in a way I didn't think possible. You've brought me back to life." Tessa's heart pounded in her chest. "Thomas, I know it might seem too soon," he continued, taking her hands in his, "and if it is, I'll wait. But I need you to know that I've fallen in love with you, completely, irrevocably in love." Tears filled Tessa's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "It doesn't seem too soon," she whispered. "Not when I feel the same way." Thomas's face lit up with hope. "You do," in answer. Tessa rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his in a gentle kiss. Thomas responded with restraint at first, then with growing passion as he wrapped his arms around her waist and pulled her closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he whispered. "Be my wife, my partner. Help me make new memories here." Tessa looked up at him, at this man who had saved her life in more ways than one. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were married in October when the aspen leaves had turned to gold and the mountains wore the first dusting of snow. The ceremony was small but joyful, attended by the ranch hands and their families, and a few friends from Silver Creek. That night, as they lay in each other's arms in what was now their bedroom in the main house, Thomas traced a gentle finger along Tessa's cheek. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. Tessa smiled up at him. "Happier than I ever thought I could be again." "I'm glad you remembered," he said, echoing the words he'd spoken that day by the river. "Remembered who you were, who you could be." "I'm glad you reminded me," she replied, kissing him softly. "That day, you didn't just save my life, Thomas. You gave me a reason to live it." Outside their window, the stars wheeled overhead, marking the passage of time. But inside, wrapped in each other's arms, Thomas and Tessa Norwood had all the time in the world to make new memories, to build a future together on the foundation of remembering.